Welcome back to the channel. Today we have 10 true airport scary stories, so it's a little bit longer than usual of a video where I normally do 5. But I'd like to hear your thoughts if you prefer 10 stories or 5 stories, or just a mix of both, which is what I'll probably keep doing. But other than that, let's get into it and start reading the stories.
This is something that happened just a couple of months ago. So I was at the airport and I had a flight to go back home. I already had one flight that day, but had a layover for a couple of hours at another airport. This was not too big of a deal. My plan was to just get to my gate and then wait there for the connecting flight. So that's what I did, only to find out that my connecting flight had been delayed. This was annoying. I sat down on one of the seats by the gate where several other people were also sitting and waiting. I decided to just listen to some podcasts and try to relax until we would finally be boarding. So I put in my headphones and started listening. Eventually, I got sleepy and I started dozing off while sitting there. I'm not sure exactly how long I was asleep for. It wasn't too long, but when I woke up, I realized that the flight still was not boarding. But I also realized that there was now someone sitting directly behind me. These were the typical waiting areas by the airport gates, where it's rows of seats that are right back to back with each other. There honestly wasn't that many other people around at all anymore, seeing as how the flight had been delayed, and who knows when it was even boarding. But I sensed right away the person right directly in the seat behind me. It felt like they were rather close, so I kind of turned around to look, and I saw this kind of taller and skinny guy sitting there. As soon as I turned around and looked at him, he quickly kind of turned and moved. It was like he had either been looking at me or he was startled when I looked back at him. I thought that it was a little bit odd, but then I just turned back and continued sitting there. This whole time, the podcast that I was listening to was playing, and I still had my headphones in, so I couldn't really hear anything else. At that point, I got up to see if the flight had been delayed again or what. I now looked around and saw that there was like nobody else waiting. I then saw that the flight had been canceled altogether. It must have been canceled while I was asleep. I was frustrated, obviously. I was in this city where I didn't even know anyone, and it was like 10 p.m. So now I would have to be on a flight the next morning. I decided to find a cheap hotel nearby for the night as I was very tired and I wanted to get some good sleep. I found one online and then decided to get an Uber to drive me there. Meanwhile, I was still waiting near the boarding area where I had been before. That guy I told you about was still sitting nearby as well. It was just us two in that area. I figured that maybe he was supposed to be on my flight and was in a similar situation. So I walked away from there and out towards the pickup area to wait for my ride. The airport was obviously quiet at this hour with it being later. There was still a good amount of people around though, but it was sparse. And in my time waiting for the Uber, I noticed that skinny guy walking into the area. Nevertheless, I soon got into my Uber and we left for the hotel. It was a cheaper place that was maybe a 5-minute drive from the airport. The hotel was not like a dump or anything, it actually was not that bad, but it was pretty cheap. I arrived, checked in, and then got up to my room which was on the 2nd floor. With it now being almost 11 o'clock, aside from the front desk clerk, I saw no one. That is, until I was walking to my room. I happened to hear someone else walking in the hallway behind me. I looked back, and it was the same guy, the guy from the airport. My logical reaction to this was that this guy was in the same boat as me. If he was supposed to be on my flight and it was cancelled, maybe he just found the nearest hotel and was also staying here for the night. But still, it gave me a bad feeling, and it seemed a little bit odd. I mean, I didn't see anyone else from the flight. I didn't even know anyone who was for sure on it. Nevertheless, I just walked the rest of the way to my room and went inside. Pretty much, I just wanted to go right to sleep. I was tired and it had been a long day of travel. I changed, got ready for bed, and then turned out all the lights to try to fall asleep. However, there was then a knock at my door. This gave me a bad feeling. I figured that it might be that same guy that I kept seeing. I did not get up to answer the door though. I didn't want to. The knock had been kind of quiet, but it was still clear with how quiet it was in the room. Then there was the sound of the doorknob slowly turning, but it didn't open as it was locked. I was really creeped out now. There was once more another short set of knocks that were not very loud on the door. I still didn't move. Finally, I heard footsteps walking away. I got up only at that point and went to the door. I looked out and the coast was clear, but I was now paranoid. I knew that I wouldn't be able to get any sleep unless I could get some peace of mind. I left my hotel room and went down to the lobby and reported the incident to the man working at the front desk. When I told him about it, I also asked him if there was a man that checked in before or after me, and then described the guy to him. The man at the front desk told me that nobody at all had checked in aside from me in the last 2 hours. so that meant that the man did not have a room there. He must have been prowling around on his own. The guy at the front desk then said that he would call the police. I went back to my room and the cops got there and I guess looked around the premises, but the man must have left because I didn't hear anything about them catching him. I was able to get some sleep though, and then my flight was the next morning. I was nervous that the same guy would be on the flight, but he was not. So I guess he was just a creepy guy at the airport. This is something that happened a couple of years ago on a flight that I was on. I travel a decent amount, flying at least 5 times a year or so. Anyways, one time I was on a flight back home, and it was the nighttime. This flight was not that busy for whatever reason. There was a considerable amount of open seats, which I don't see very often. I happened to be sitting in one of the last rows in the far back of the plane, but I didn't mind. I really don't care where I sit, and I had the whole row to myself, which was great. Behind me was I think 2 more rows. I don't recall if anybody was in either of them, but I remember that directly across the aisle from me, I guess technically in the same row, was another guy. He had this 3-seat section also to himself like I did. He just seemed like an average guy, and he was looking down at his phone when I noticed him after boarding. Most of the people were in the rows ahead of us, as up there was a lot more people. So the flight took off, and I was mostly just watching a movie that I put on. At one point, maybe almost an hour into the flight, I happened to glance over to my left. The guy sitting across the aisle from me was now wearing this really creepy clown mask, and he was looking right at me. It was like this hideous mask that was absolutely scary looking. I had to do a double take when I saw it. Then when I realized he was actually wearing that, I was confused. Was he trying to creep me out? He looked back up ahead and not at me anymore. I almost said something, but I didn't. The lights were mostly off as it was nighttime and the plane was very quiet. Most people seemed to be either sleeping or quietly reading or watching movies or whatever. It wasn't really the type of flight to be doing something like this. I just kind of smiled and shook my head and then went back to my movie. I looked over maybe 5 or 10 minutes later and he was still wearing it. I had the same reaction, and I say I was smiling, but in reality it was pretty creepy and I was kind of weirded out by it. Soon after that though, I ended up dozing off and falling asleep for a little while. When I woke up, we were maybe 20 minutes from landing. So I looked around and the guy no longer had the mask on. He looked completely normal again. I thought the whole thing was weird, but I was glad that we were landing soon. For the last bit of the flight, I just went on my phone. Then we landed, and after coming to a stop, everybody started to stand up to leave. Because I was in the back, I was obviously one of the last people standing to exit the flight. But that same guy who had the clown mask was as well. I eventually stood up and went into the aisle where we would wait to be leaving soon. I found myself just standing next to the guy waiting to leave. So I decided to ask him about the mask. When I did, he completely denied it. And I didn't ask him in an angry way, I kind of asked him in a half-joking way. He said he was never wearing a mask on the flight and he didn't have one, and he sounded annoyed when he said it. I told him that I saw it, and when I did, the guy still straight up denied it. I couldn't believe it. It was pretty weird. So then we just both left. I think he was either just saying that to make it more creepy, or because he didn't want to get in trouble and he thought I might report him. I think that he was just messing with me and anybody else that saw him, but I still find it very creepy and weird. A couple of months ago, I had a really crazy event that took place. So I was driving home from work one night. I work in the city and live about 15 to 20 minutes outside of it. And on the way home, I drive right by the airport typically. Well, I happened to work late that night, so by now it was almost midnight. This meant that the roads were much quieter, but being in the city like that, there's still cars out on the road. When I got to the part in the drive where I went right past the airport, I noticed a car pull out from the airport onto the road right next to me. I was in the left lane, and the car pulled out from the airport road into the right lane of the road that I was on. It was an older black sedan, and the way that he pulled onto the road was very fast and almost reckless. Even though it went into the right lane that was next to me, it made me think for a second that he might hit me, and I slowed down. The car then slowed down a little, and I passed it. But then the car changed lanes and went into my lane, which was the left one. Based on his driving style, I figured that he was going to speed up, and so I moved over into the right lane to let him pass me. Except he did not. Instead, he now went into the right lane, continuing to drive directly behind me. So I just kept on driving home. But for whatever reason, this car then sped up and got right on my bumper. I was now confused. I had no idea why this car was tailgating me like this, and as far as I knew, he had just pulled out of the airport parking lot and I happened to be driving by. I turned eventually where I had to, and I hoped that the car behind me would not, but it did. It continued to drive right directly behind me as I drove down the roads. There were not many other cars around, so it made it easier for this guy to be behind me and tail me. And I could not see who was driving the car other than just a basic silhouette of the driver, which looked like a man. I continued to drive the way home, but I tried to pull over to make the car pass me. When I did, the car started to pull over as well, and I knew I was in trouble. I could not go home now, or who knows what would happen. I didn't want this guy knowing where I lived, and if I stopped, it seemed like he was going to stop too, and then who knows what could happen. So instead, I decided to make a quick U-turn, and I started going the opposite way down the road. I did that, and as you could guess, the guy behind me did the same. I drove down the road now going back towards the airport. When I made it back to the other road, I wasn't sure what to do, so I decided to just go to the airport. That was a place where there was lots of security and people around 24/7. So I kept driving down the road and then turned into the airport drive. The car behind me did the same. I continued all the way until the pickup and drop-off area. There were a few other cars parked there, including a security vehicle. I went and drove right behind that security car, and the car behind me continued going past us. He drove a ways down, but then he parked on the side of the road like he was going to pick someone up or something. I was relieved for a moment and then got nervous again. At first I thought he was going to just leave, but now it seemed like he was waiting there for me. I waited there for a couple seconds, and when the car did not leave, I decided to report him to the security officer. I left my car and approached the security vehicle. I told the officer what was going on, and as I was doing this, the car that was up there started to drive away. The security officer then pulled away and went after him. I then went home. I was able to make it back safely and never saw that guy again. I'm not sure what was going on there. Why would he follow me? I wasn't in his way and I didn't honk at him or anything. Did he just randomly choose to follow me for no reason? I really don't know, but I'm glad that I had the idea to go back to the airport to get away from him. Last month, I took a flight to Chicago. I was at the airport of another major city, which is where I live. So after I was dropped off at the airport, I made it through security and all that, and I was waiting to board my flight. I sat there in one of the chairs waiting, and I was really early. I always get to the airport with extra time, so I'm never rushing. But on this particular morning, the security line was not very long, and I made it through pretty quickly. I still had a couple of hours to wait. In this time that I was sitting there and minding my own business, this kind of creepy looking guy came and sat right next to me. He didn't say hi or anything, he just sat right there next to me, and there was plenty of other open seats nearby. I looked over and did not recognize him. He was a bigger guy, was wearing sunglasses, and had longer hair. He also smelled like sweat. I didn't want to be rude and say anything, or just get up and leave right away, so I continued to sit there for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. The man was just sitting there, appearing to go on his phone. He didn't say anything to me. Then, after maybe 10 minutes, I decided to get up and walk around. This is something that I probably would have done anyways, as there was still so much time until my flight boarded, obviously. So I got up, took my rolling suitcase with me, and began walking away. My plan was to just walk to the end of the area that I was in and back, and see if there were any places that interested me. I could stop in one of the shops, and also maybe get a coffee or something. So after I began to walk away, I glanced back and saw the man start to stand up. This was not good. Was he going to follow me? I didn't want to creep myself out, so I didn't look where he was going. I just looked straight ahead and continued walking, and was trying to walk fast. There were a good amount of other people walking around like always in the airport, so it should have been pretty easy for me to blend in with the crowd. I walked to one end, turned around, and started to walk back. In this time, I did not see the man, but I also wasn't really looking for him. In fact, I didn't want to see him. I was really just trying to ignore the whole thing. I went into a gift shop and was looking around there. That's when I noticed the man again. This gift shop was kind of crowded, and I turned a corner to see the guy walking right towards me. I turned and almost brushed shoulders with him, but we went our separate ways. I quickly left the shop after that. Then I went to a coffee shop nearby and looked around for him. I didn't see where he went. Eventually, I got my coffee, and then I walked back to where I had been waiting for my flight. I sat down in a different spot this time, which was closer to other people but not directly next to them. I looked around but still didn't see the guy anymore, so I felt better now. But I was also worried that he would show up again at any moment. As I was sitting there though, I noticed something. On my suitcase was now a sticker, and I didn't know where it had come from. The sticker was mostly black, so it sort of blended in with my suitcase, but then it had what looked like a QR code on it as well. I had no idea when or how that sticker got there, but obviously I decided to scan the QR code to see what it was, because I was curious. I took out my cell phone, opened the camera app, and then saw a link come up at the bottom. I clicked on it. When I did, I was creeped out by what I saw. It went to this video of that same man who I had been seeing. He looked to be in some dark basement type of room. He was laughing in an insane and creepy way and just staring at the camera. It was very disturbing. The creepy laughing just kept going and going. The guy didn't say anything, he was just laughing. After like 2 or 3 minutes straight of it, I closed out of it. Then I looked around, wondering if the guy was watching me or something, but I didn't see him anywhere. I kept looking around, but he didn't come back. Soon I boarded my flight to Chicago. I haven't seen that man since then. I'm still really freaked out by the whole thing though. Maybe it was just a prank by him, but it's a pretty creepy thing to do. I've gone to the airport to pick up my friends or family members on more than a few occasions, but one time stands out as the most memorable by far, and it was also a pretty scary experience. I was picking up a friend after a flight, and it was about 10 o'clock at night, so a little bit later. I drove to the airport, which is maybe 15 minutes from my apartment. When I got there, I was a little bit early, and I parked on the side of the road in the pickup spot. However, I looked at the flight that my friend was on my phone, only to see that it would not be landing for another 25 minutes. So I decided to park my car and walk around a little bit. I didn't want to just sit in my car for however long it would take, and I didn't want to drive back home either, because I would have to go right back right away. So I went to a nearby parking lot which had a good amount of open spaces at that hour. I parked my car and then got out and walked into the airport. It was pretty quiet, but I've always enjoyed the atmosphere of an airport. There are so many different people from so many different places going through there. But I was just walking around getting some steps in before my friend arrived. I didn't mind too much and wasn't annoyed or anything. I walked around for maybe 15 minutes or so. Every so often, I was checking my phone to see if my friend's flight had landed. Finally, I saw that it did. So at that point, I decided to go back to my car and then drive back around to the pickup spot. So I walked out of the airport and then back over to my car in the parking lot. However, right when I arrived at the parking lot, I heard something. It was not nearly as well lit over there, though you could see a little bit as there were several streetlights every so often. But when I saw my car, I realized the sounds were of a person on the other side of it. When I got closer, I realized that there was somebody standing at the driver's door of my car. I was coming at the car from the passenger side, so my view was mostly obstructed. I stopped where I was and could barely see the person's head sticking out above my car. About 40 feet away, I stopped and watched. It looked like somebody was trying to open my driver's door or possibly break in. So I said in a firm voice, "Hey, what are you doing?" The person stopped and looked up at me for a moment, but then they looked right back down at the car door. They continued seemingly trying to break in. I really thought that I would have scared them off. I yelled this time saying, "Get away from my car." This didn't get them away. But now the guy started to bang on my window. It was like he couldn't get in, so now he was going to try to break it. I yelled that I was calling the cops, and that still didn't get him to move away. I didn't want to approach him, so I then had the idea to hit the alarm button on my car keys. I hit the button and held it. Now the car was making a very loud alarm sound. The guy started hitting it harder for a few moments, but then I think he realized that he couldn't stay there like that. So after about 5 seconds of hitting the door and window, he finally turned and ran off. I then called the cops and reported him. I went to my car and got inside of it. Thankfully, and surprising to me, the window was not broken, but there were some obvious marks on the door and window. I stayed there and waited in my car for only about a minute before an officer was there. I reported what happened, and they said they would look for the guy, and then I drove back over to the pickup area. I then picked up my friend and left. I think that's a pretty crazy experience at the airport, and I'm glad that the guy finally left when I hit the alarm button. A couple of years ago, I was flying to California. It was a flight where I had a window seat on one side of the plane. I travel a decent amount, and I don't mind it at all. I would say that I'm pretty easygoing too. Some people certainly push the limits at times though during travel, breaking rules both written and unwritten, and one time a man seemed to break them all. It was on this flight, and the guy kept hitting the back of my seat. It first happened pretty early on in the flight, and I first assumed that it was an accident or an honest mistake, and I didn't react or anything. But after that, it happened again maybe 10 or 20 minutes later, and then again. Both times I ignored it, but it was annoying, and it only lasted a few seconds. Almost an hour into the flight, the guy started repeatedly kicking the back of my seat. It was so annoying. I didn't know who was doing it at this point, if it was some kid or what. So finally then, I turned around and looked. I'm normally not one to complain or tell someone to be quiet, but this was just too much. I looked back over the seat, and I saw this guy just already staring at me with an annoyed and borderline angry face. It just ticked me off. I said, "Why do you keep hitting my seat?" He just glared at me and then said, "I'm not." The guy was sitting in the window seat directly behind mine, and then the middle seat next to him was open. Then the aisle seat had a guy who was fast asleep in it. I just shook my head and turned back around. As expected, within 5 minutes he hit my seat again. I instantly turned back around. I said, "You just did." He told me to leave him alone. I just thought, okay, so it's going to be this kind of flight. Thankfully, it was only an hour and a half long of a flight, or else that would be really annoying. I decided that I was just going to try to ignore his kickings. Once more, he started up again. It was like when he realized I wasn't going to do anything, he would kick the seat more. So I decided to tell on him. When the flight attendants came around to offer snacks, I told the woman about the guy and said how he was denying it. She said she would keep an eye on him. So what she did was after the food service, she went back near his aisle and I think watched him. Meanwhile, when I was taking a drink, he kicked my seat really hard and I spilled. The flight attendant went over and started yelling at the guy. He then started yelling, saying he was not doing anything wrong. The guy next to him woke up and everyone around us started staring at the commotion. The guy finally stopped though after that. My seat didn't get kicked again for the rest of the flight. Then when we landed, we were more than halfway down the plane. As soon as the plane stopped, this guy got up and walked by everyone to be the first one off the plane, which by the way is something that you're not supposed to do. I think everyone hated him for that. That was my craziest experience on a flight. I was about 20 years old at the time and traveling alone for the first time. It was a big deal for me because I had never really navigated airports, connections, and long-distance travel by myself before. The trip itself had gone smoothly, but by the time I was heading home, I was completely drained. On my way back from my destination, I landed in New York City at JFK Airport. I had already been traveling for about 24 hours between flights, layovers, and waiting around in terminals. I was exhausted, running on very little sleep, and just wanted to get to the bus station as soon as possible so I could finally start the last leg of my journey home. I collected my bags from a baggage claim and headed out to get a taxi. The airport was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. There were people moving in every direction, cars pulling up and leaving, and all the usual airport chaos. As soon as I walked out of the airport, I was approached by a man who told me I would have to wait hours for a taxi, but he could take me wherever I needed to go. He claimed to be a driver and spoke with a lot of confidence, like he did this all the time. At first, what he said seemed believable. I had never been to JFK before, and I didn't know how things worked there. I noticed that the line for the taxis had a few people in it, but nothing crazy. Certainly not anything that looked like a several-hour wait. Looking back, that should have been my first clue, but at the time, I was tired, inexperienced, and focused on getting home as quickly as possible. I followed the man towards his car. As we were walking through the pickup area, another man in a black SUV with fully tinted windows rolled up beside us and slightly lowered his passenger window. The two exchanged a few words in their language, which I couldn't understand. It was quick, only a few seconds. The man who was walking with me nodded at him, and the other driver rolled his window back up and drove away, continuing to circle the parking area. I don't know why, but that was the moment I started feeling uneasy. Nothing actually happened. There was no direct threat, no obvious red flags beyond the fact that I was following a stranger, but something about the interaction was off. Maybe it was just how quickly they communicated. Maybe it was the fact that the other SUV was just circling around waiting. Maybe I was simply starting to listen to my instincts. Either way, I began to feel like this was not a good idea. When we approached his car, which was also a black SUV with tinted windows, he opened the trunk and put my luggage inside. I remember staring at the back of the vehicle and suddenly feeling trapped before I had even gotten in. In that moment, something told me to go back to the taxi stand. I quickly grabbed my luggage back and made several excuses about changing my plans. I tried to be polite because I didn't want to anger him, but I was already committed to leaving. The man's demeanor changed immediately. He became extremely insistent that I go with him. He kept telling me he was legitimate and said that he could show me his cards proving he worked for a driving service. Oddly enough, despite repeating this several times, he never actually showed me anything. The more he pushed, the more convinced I became that I needed to leave. I mumbled another excuse, turned around, and started walking away as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. He continued calling after me for several seconds, trying to get me back. I didn't look back. Once I got closer to the taxi stand, I started feeling better almost immediately. There were other travelers around, airport staff nearby, and an official line of transportation options. Suddenly, the whole situation seemed a lot less stressful. I ended up getting a taxi about 15 minutes later. As I sat in the back seat heading towards the bus station, I kept replaying the interaction in my head. Maybe the man really was a legitimate driver trying to get business. Whether I was paranoid or not, I've never regretted walking away. If nothing else, it taught me that when you're alone in an unfamiliar place and something feels off, it's usually worth listening to that instinct. It was the month of December, and I had just finished my college exams for the semester. I was 21, and because I was in a long-distance relationship, I had not seen my boyfriend for over 3 months. Since we both had some free time, we planned to get away to the mountains to experience the snow. The only catch was that I had to fly to his city alone. We had been together for 5 years, though, and I was determined to make it happen. The day of my flight finally arrived. I was seated by the window next to a man who looked to be in his late 30s. The moment he sat down, something about him made me uncomfortable. I couldn't explain it, and I brushed it off as me being unfairly judgmental. We were both on our phones, but I couldn't help but notice how constantly his phone kept buzzing with loud notification sounds. After takeoff, I realized the aisle seat next to him was completely empty. I figured he would move over for the extra space, but he stayed glued to the middle seat beside me. Instead, I caught him glancing at me every few seconds while I looked out the window. Eventually, he started making conversations with me. He asked where I was from, if I lived in the city we were flying to, how old I was, and whether someone was picking me up from the airport. Every question made me more uneasy. I had a bad feeling, so I lied. I told him I lived in that city instead of admitting I was visiting. I also avoided giving him any real personal information, not even my real name. He ignored my obvious lack of interest and kept talking about his job and his weekend travel plans while I stayed focused on my phone. Even without looking at him, I could feel him leaning closer towards me. About 20 minutes before landing, the cabin lights were dimmed for the descent at night. I happened to glance over and saw him staring directly at me with this unsettling grin on his face. It honestly felt like he thought we shared some romantic moment. I had a bad feeling, and I turned back towards the window and pretended to take pictures outside. Then he asked, "You're so cute, can you give me your number?" I froze. "No," I replied. "Then give me your Instagram," he said. By this point, I knew he wasn't going to stop. I said, "No, I have a boyfriend. Stop." He stared at me for what felt like forever, before suddenly smiling again and offering me a bottle of water like nothing had happened. Thankfully, the flight attendants announced we were preparing to unload the plane. Just when I thought it was over, he slowly reached his hand towards me and whispered, "Can I hold your hand?" "What? No, are you mad?" I said it loud enough to make the people nearby look over. He simply blinked at me and asked, "Why?" I didn't answer. I just wanted off the plane. The minute the doors opened, I grabbed my bags and got off as quickly as I could. As I walked through the airport, I turned around and saw him pointing at me while talking to a few men who apparently had been traveling with him. They all smiled as they watched me walk away. Immediately, I texted my boyfriend, who told me to leave the airport as quickly as possible and not let the man catch up to me. I collected my luggage and made it outside to wait for my Uber. For a moment, I thought that I was finally safe. Then, I felt someone touch my hair. I spun around, and it was him. He stood there wearing that same creepy smile. "Do you need a ride home?" he asked. "We could take you," he said, gesturing over to his friends who were farther away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed my luggage and walked straight over to a family with young children. I quietly explained what happened and asked if they could walk me to my Uber. Without hesitation, they agreed. They stayed with me until I safely got in the car, while the man stood several feet away, silently watching me with those same cold eyes. Thankfully, he didn't follow the Uber. I made it safely to my boyfriend, and the rest of the trip was amazing. As time passed, the incident slowly became something I rarely thought about. A few months ago, I was scrolling through Instagram when I noticed a new follow request. I opened it, and my heart dropped. Somehow, it was the same creepy guy from the airport. He had found my account. Before I could even process it, a message appeared which said, "Remember me?" I blocked him immediately, and then I deleted my Instagram. I haven't been back on Instagram since then. I was on a plane once and noticed that although people were still boarding, there was a large number of seats around me unoccupied. The last people on, though, were all together and consisted of one family traveling together. There were 4 adults, about 10 children, ranging from toddler age to high school and young adults. They had the usual look of a large group traveling with children, some of whom were shy and withdrawn, and others were running around, with the adults looking frazzled, trying to keep everyone and everything together. When they'd all been seated, they seemed to be taking issue with the seating, as one member of their party was supposed to sit several rows back. The flight attendant apologized and said that sometimes their computer will mess things up, but assured them that there was seating available for everyone. The family sat down -1 and started with the usual, "That's a shame, they wish they could sit up here together" type of talk. Since it seemed that their party was surrounding me, I stopped the flight attendant and asked her if I could switch seats with another passenger. This caught the attention of the large group, perhaps anticipating a complaint, but the flight attendant told me no, they don't usually do that. Everyone had been seated, but the flight attendant asked if there was a problem with where I was sitting. I explained to her that I was traveling solo and did not care where I sat, and asked if I could give my seat to the member of the family who was absent, as my seat would have put them in the midst of their group. The family overheard and thanked me as I retrieved my bag overhead and followed the flight attendant to the family member's seat. She explained what was happening, and I noticed that the family member, a young girl maybe 12 years old, seemed to be in a hurry to get back to her family and thanked me 4 times. She practically ran up the aisle, and before I could sit down, the man who had been sitting next to her was literally staring with his mouth open and asked, "What's the problem?" He got upset and said, "No, that girl was sitting here first," and the flight attendant explained to him what was happening. The man immediately looked at me and said, "No, I don't want to sit next to him. Where's the girl going?" She explained to him that there was no issue and nothing she could do now. Now, I want to assure everyone that I was not in the habit of judging people by their appearance, but this guy was the definition of red flags. He was overweight and paunchy, half bald, with a few strands combed over, thick glasses, and no chin. He was a mouth breather and kept his mouth open constantly, drooling on himself and then sucking it back in between heavy breathing. If there were a textbook example of a creep, it would be him. As I was putting my bag overhead, he started talking to himself under his breath about how it was BS and just my luck, and why did they move that girl. I wanted to say something to him, but I didn't. It wasn't long before my seat neighbor got a call, and he was talking about an upcoming court appearance. The only time I almost said anything to him was when he started blatantly watching inappropriate things on his laptop. He kept repeating, "Oh yeah," when a part came on that he evidently liked. I couldn't believe it. The creep finally went to sleep eventually and fortunately stayed asleep for the rest of the flight. When we were all deboarding, a woman who I presumed was the mother was standing with the girl and said, "Thank you again" to me. Looking back, I'm really glad that I switched seats, and I can't imagine what could have happened had I not done it. And shocking to absolutely no one, including myself, the man was met at the gate by security and police. I worked the overnight shift at a major airport for almost 6 years. My job wasn't exciting. I drove supplies between terminals and restocked employee areas. After a while, you learn who belongs and you recognize faces more than uniforms. One Tuesday around 2 in the morning, I noticed a guy I'd never seen before walking through the employee hallway behind Concourse C. He wore a reflective vest, dark work pants, and an airport badge clipped to his chest. Everything looked normal until he passed me. He never looked at me. That sounds strange, but airport workers usually nod or say something. Even if we don't know each other, we all spend enough time in the same restricted areas to acknowledge one another. He kept his eyes forward like he didn't want anyone to remember his face. I figured he was new. About 20 minutes later, I saw him again on the opposite side of the terminal. That caught my attention because there wasn't a reason for someone from maintenance to be over there. He wasn't carrying tools either. He stopped at a secured door and held his badge against the reader. The light flashed red. He tried again. Another red light. Then he stepped aside instead of calling someone. He waited near a food spot until the baggage employee came through the door. As soon as the door opened, he slipped in behind him without scanning his own badge. The baggage employee didn't notice. People tailgate through secure doors all the time, even though they're not supposed to. It's against policy, but it happens. An hour later, I was delivering supplies near the baggage system. I walked into a hallway that almost nobody uses unless they're assigned there. The same guy was standing in the front of an electrical cabinet. It wasn't open, he wasn't working, and he was just looking around. When he noticed me, he smiled for the first time. "Wrong hallway?" he said. I laughed because I thought he was joking. "I work here," I answered. He nodded once and then walked away without saying another word. That was enough for me. I called my supervisor and I told him I had seen someone acting strangely. He asked for a description and said the airport police would check it out. I figured that was the end of it. About 30 minutes later, I saw two officers talking with a cleaning supervisor. They looked at several people walking past, but never stopped anyone. I assumed they couldn't find him. Near 4 in the morning, I was taking empty carts back to storage when I noticed the same man again. This time he was coming out of an office that should have been locked. He had a radio in his hand, not an airport-issued radio either. When he saw me, he turned around and walked in another direction. I followed for maybe 20 seconds before deciding that wasn't smart. Instead, I called the airport police again and gave them his exact location. By then, he disappeared into another employee corridor. The airport never stopped operating during any of this, but later that day, our manager gathered everyone together. They had caught the man I had seen earlier, and they told us the man didn't work for the airport. He wasn't employed by any airline. He wasn't a contractor either. The badge clipped to his vest was fake. According to airport police, he had entered through an employee entrance by following a real worker through a secure door. Once there, he spent hours walking through restricted areas without anyone questioning him. He had even tried several locked offices until he found one that somebody had forgotten to secure. Nobody told us exactly what he wanted, so therefore rumors spread for weeks. Some people claimed he was trying to steal equipment. Others thought he wanted employee information. A few believed he was testing security for someone else. We had to have a big meeting about being more vigilant and maintaining a secure space of restricted areas. I had no idea what the man's plan was, but I'm glad that there was no catastrophe at the airport that night.